Hello my fabulous subscribers. Today we will be talking about cutting fabric. So one of my members on my YouTube channel, hello YouTube channel members, thank you so much for joining. I gotta remember to say hello to you important people. Alright, so today we'll be talking about cutting fabric. So Beverly Jenkins, as I said, one of the channel members, reached out to me on my Facebook Messenger. Hi Beverly, I hope you don't mind I mentioned to everybody that you reached out, that she was having some problems with cutting fabric. So me being myself and loving all of my subscribers, I decided I will make a video so that anybody else who is suffering the same issues will have some ideas on how to take some steps to correct it. So here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go. All right. So this is what's going to happen. So what I need you to think about is a few items. I will list them on the screen as we go along, just to ensure that you get the points, okay? And you can implement whichever of these points that make sense to you or you think that you're missing. When we start to cut fabric, we tend to just go dive into it, isn't it? We don't, especially when you are a big beginner, you don't think about, oh, am I cutting it right? Am I doing anything wrong? You don't think about that. You just think, right, I want to do this. I want to follow the pattern. And most patterns don't tell you to make sure you cut on the right grain. Each pattern will assume that the person making the product or the item knows where to cut. So this is where the gap can sometimes cause a little bit of an issue, and then you find that your end result with your block, it's unshapen, it's some are big, some are small, etc. So the first thing you need to be aware of is that if you, as a quilter or somebody who uses fabric, tend to pre-wash, you must iron those fabrics. When they're dry, iron them. Now, I personally do not pre-wash my fabrics. As far as I am concerned, to me, the manufacturers has gone through the whole process to ensure that the dye does not bleed, okay? To me, this was something that happened years ago when my mom was sewing and beyond. It doesn't happen that much anymore, and certainly the catchers you can throw into the sewing machine, into the washing machine to catch if there's a bleed. And to be honest, the fabric that will most likely bleed is red, very most likely. Okay, so that doesn't tend to happen in most. So I trust the manufacturer and the dyes that they put in. I think they go through a lot of testing to ensure that the fabric doesn't happen to the fabric anymore. Okay, so if you are a pre-washer, definitely let it dry and iron. If you're not a pre-washer, do not just cut your fabric. If your fabric is rough, it's crumple, and that's what I mean. If you're not a pre-wash person and your fabric is crumpled, you must iron them. Never cut on fabrics that's crinkled or wrinkled, okay? Must be ironed. And the third tip so far, before we dive into it, is to make sure you have a flat surface. So let's get some fabric out, and I'm going to talk about certain things as well as I demonstrate how to cut. And I hope that this video has given you some value. And if it has, like and subscribe, hit the like button, leave a comment down below, and let me know if there's any other videos that you would like to see where there's a gap for you. Because this is a learning process. There's not a race. We all had to learn at some point. So don't worry about it. I will make the video for you, and I will inform you of the steps you need to take so that you can close the gap on any issues that you're having. So let's dive into the cutting of the fabric now. Now there's a few things that is required before we start cutting our fabric. So we need a very good cutting mat. One of the reasons why I'm talking about a cutting mat is that if your cutting mat is, for example, not a self-healing mat, what could happen is that it will get slivers or cuts in between, and your blade, your rotary blade, will get stuck into it, which making your cut jagged, not even. It can even smooth the fabric as well. Okay, so the first step is to have a very good self-healing mat. I would say this is one of a very good investment that you would need to get. There are different kinds, but just make sure it's a self-healing mat. All right. Rotary blade is very important. Sharp scissors if you don't feel confident handling one of these, and a new blade or a sharp blade. One of the measures that I tend to make a mistake with is that, and many of you will feel that my blade is not sharp. It's not that. It's that when I'm cutting, I don't always press down. I don't put my weight forward on the blade. I tend to just glide. Okay, now you do need to add a little bit of pressure so that the blade goes through. One of the reasons I don't add too much pressure is because I tend to get a pain in my arm here, and so sometimes I'm a bit wary of having to inflame that muscle again. So that's the reason why I don't do it. Okay, I keep reminding myself to get an electric cutter, but I never seem to remember to order one. So that is on my to-do list. So that's one of the reasons if you see that sometimes you split the fabric and it's not pulled apart, is because you haven't added enough pressure. And I'm not saying add so much pressure that you need to go off. It's not about that. It's about enough pressure so that it goes through the fabric. Okay, so that's 2 and 3 together. All right, so the next objective is to have a weight on the fabric. So when you roll your fabric out, what could possibly happen is that the fabric can slide. So for example, if it's just a fabric I have here and it's hanging off the table, it can slide, it can move. So a good way is to have some kind of weight, whether it's a bag of sugar, you know, or a jar of sugar, whatever it is, so on that fabric so it doesn't slip or slide or move. Okay, so that's if it's hanging off. I would say that's a good thumb to follow as well. If you're cutting and it's just on the table, you're smoothing it out, put a weight on the fabric. Fabric likes to move, it shifts very quickly and it's very smooth. Even your ruler can shift. Sometimes that's why you will find you need to have little grips underneath your ruler. So that's what? 5 tips so far. All right, so grips under the ruler so it stops it sliding, because a slight movement will make your blocks off. Okay, so going back to the other one where I said, so weight on your materials. Okay, so that's it. So let's move on to the fabric itself. So another reason why your blocks could be out of shape is because you are cutting on the wrong grain. When I first started sewing, there was one thing I remember seeing my mom did, and that was to test the width or the strength of the fabric on the selvage. So let me show you where the selvage is. Now, there's certain things you need to take heed of before you start cutting. And many times we tend to forget that. We're so excited about starting the project that we forget that we need to make sure we are on the right grain. And I remember when I first heard about this word grain, I think, what on earth are these people talking about? I am sure I am not the only person to actually wonder about that. Okay, now what I am doing here is to ensuring I'm using my long ruler because I don't want to waste the fabric. I'm very much a stingy person when it comes to fabric usage. I don't like wasting fabric. So I'm just cutting exactly what I need. So I'm going to put it this way. And I'm going to cut up to there. There you go. Right, I'm just going to cut that bit off there. So as I was saying, so we need to make sure we're cutting on the right grain. So fabric is made woven. So when you're putting the fabric together, it is cut, it is woven like so. So which meaning you have horizontal lines and vertical lines. So it's like a diagram of something like this. That is what fabric looks like. Okay, so that's what it means when it's woven. So it's like that. You can't see it. There's lots and lots of grains going horizontally and vertically. All right, so let me just remove this. And notice that when I cut, I actually press down. And notice I haven't got any sort of strings to pull apart because I put a little bit of pressure when I was cutting. Now, what I wanted to talk about is the selvage. All right, now the selvage is this part here, that white part you see. Sometimes what you would notice it as is that the edge of the fabric is slightly frayed. Can you see that? And sometimes it has holes on it. All right, so the holes where it was hooked onto the machine to stretch so that it continues to woven, all those fibers, all those threads are woven in together. I remember my husband and I, when we were in London, we went and actually saw how this was done years ago. All right, it's really fascinating to see. Nevertheless, this is what you would most likely see when you buy your fabric. So you'll get this white strip here, and this is just a strip that the start of the fabric is usually more tightly woven than the fabric itself. Okay, it also tells you the name of the fabric. Okay, I think this one is a Daphne floral mix, which is slightly cut off. It tells you the colors that's within the fabric. This one doesn't say that because it's floral already. Sometimes it also tells you the wash, whether it can iron or not. It gives you all the information there, so that's really good. Sometimes it also gives you, it actually, this one says it's actually, you can hand wash it, machine wash it, you can iron, you can air dry it, you can soak it. So lots of information on there. Sometimes it actually gives you the colors that's used. It also gives you a number. So if you were making this particular quilt and you ran out of this fabric, you can go back to where you bought it and say, right, this is the number, so they can look it up. Okay, so that is the selvage. So first of all, before you cut your fabric, find your selvage. Okay, and the way how I teach my students is to, I don't go into the perpendicular lines and, you know, the vertical. That's a little bit confusing because some people just wanted the basics. The basics is this. You lay your fabric out and you are cutting opposite the selvage. So I will put my selvage on this side and my fabric here is folded. Okay, so I'll put my selvage, my fabric down, and I'll put my ruler here. So my ruler now becomes horizontal, isn't it? My selvage is there, my ruler is there. If I start cutting this way, I am cutting on the wrong grain. What that means is that my blocks is going to be stretching. Now, one good thing about the selvage, let's go back to it for a second, is that when I was a little girl, I used to see my mom doing this with the fabric. I didn't know at that time why she was doing it, okay? But obviously, as I got older, I understood the process. So if for whatever reason you don't have the selvage on your fabric, this is one way of learning or to figure it out, to remember. When it's on you can actually hear can you hear that? That's the strong part of the fabric. You hear that snap back. That is how I used to see my mom testing the fabric. And it doesn't stretch, it's nice and firm. This here is not. Can you see how it falls over when I bend it? I am not bending it over. Yeah, it bends over itself because I am pulling on it. You can actually see how the fabric stretch. Whereas with this one, it stays up and it makes that sound. This one makes a hollow sound. Do you hear the difference? Go back to this one. Yeah? That's one way of remembering where the selvage is. Okay? So when you're cutting, make sure you cut opposite the selvage. First tip for that one. Another tip before you start cutting, if you're cutting fabric that's folded, ensure that the fabric is smooth. Okay, ensure that the fold here is smooth. What you don't want is to have it like that. You don't want it crumble up inside and you can't see it, because you will cut it like that. And I am speaking from experience, right? It's like that. It's crumbled inside, especially if you have 2 or 3 layers. If you fold it over like so, make sure that it's nice and smooth. You don't feel anything lumpy there on the fold, okay? Very important when cutting fabric is to keep it lovely and flat. That's really, really important. So once you know what size you're going to be cutting, whether you're left-handed, right-handed, however you want to line it up, I like to make sure my selvages meet, smoothing out my fabric, turn it around, and then you will cut your fabric, your selvage away, and you start cutting to the desired size that you want. Now, I tend to line up the fabric on one of my cutting lines here on my mat. I make sure it's level. Now, what I tend to do was to try and save fabric and not trim the edges properly and just say, oh, the edges it's okay, I'm going to use it like that. Don't do that. Take the time to give yourself a nice fresh cut, because then it's going to be straight. So as this is a bit jagged here, I'm going to fold it, making sure I can feel that it's nice and smooth here. Line up my fabric and try not to always line it up at the end. So for example, if it's uneven like it is there, you don't have to. As long as it's straight on the line here, then you give yourself a fresh cut. So that's what I'm going to do. Line it up, smoothing it down with my hand so I can make sure I don't feel any folds. And I will just simply just give myself a nice fresh clean cut, holding my fabric. If I had weights, I will put it there if I think my ruler is going to slide. If not, and you're confident, open up your hands nice and firm, press down and cut through. Okay, I'll do the next side as well, because I am going to cut some squares. I want to make sure both edges are lovely and straight. All right, so let's go back to the selvage again. Now these are the important stages here. So I'm now going to cut off, so my edges are straight, up and top and bottom, and I'm going to line it up on the line here, smoothen that out, and I'm going to cut off my selvage. Now, sometimes with your fabric, you would notice that sometimes it can be a little bit not flat, if that makes sense. It'll be a little bit like, you know, a little pull to the side. Doesn't look very smooth. And that's because the selvage is woven so tightly that sometimes the closest fabric to the end of the selvage can be a little bit not flat. So it doesn't sit flat on the table. But once you cut that selvage off, then the fabric begins to relax and you can just smoothen it out, okay? So this is why most people will cut away the selvage. So I'm lining it up on the mat, and one of the techniques for cutting accurately, this is why I always say you need a long ruler, because you want to extend the ruler beyond the size of the fabric. Hence why you would say some people will fold the fabric. It's so that they can line up the line at the top and line up the line at the bottom, just to ensure that you're cutting a straight line. Before you cut, if you're unsure about that, you can use your heat erasable pen and mark the line. So again, you have a secondary guider. So you're having your mark at the top, mark at the bottom on your cutting mat, and you can also have your cutting lines, which will enable you to line up properly. Another test you can look for is to make sure that your squares on your ruler line up with the squares on the mat. Again, making sure that you have all of these measures in place before you start cutting. Once you're happy with that, notice again, I am cutting it horizontally opposite the selvage. So I'm going to make sure everything is nice and smooth. Hold my ruler nice and firm, and then press down and cut. Now my selvage is away. Okay, I am now going to cut my rows. one of the good things to do is to cut the width of the fabric that you need in rows, so that way you don't have to be twisting your ruler in any way, shape or form. So I've cut my selvage off now. I know this is my straight, strong grain here, and I'm going to move over to the width that I need. And again, I'm checking that I can line up at the top and at the bottom, and I know that my cuts are going to be accurate. And it's important that you take your time. Another step, double check again. That's another way of making sure that you cut straight and you cut accurately. Fabric's expensive. You know, always count 2, 3, 4 times, however much it makes you feel confident, and then you do your cut. Hold it on your ruler again and simply cutting. All right, so I'm going to move that out of the way. So now I have 2 layers here now. So now I need to do whatever cut I did horizontally. Now I'm going to cut vertically, because this is still my selvage here. This here is not very strong, but it's a small piece, but it's not very strong. You can see how it ripples there already. Whereas when I move this, there is no ripple. This side, see how the fabric bends? Hopefully you can pick it up on the camera. So I'm going to shuffle back my fabric here. This is another method as well. There are so many steps that sometimes as a newbie you tend not to pay attention to, and you just simply think, oh, I get so excited, and you dive straight into it. And this is how I learn, literally by watching my mom, taking an interest, questioning everything. And it's not, don't be afraid to ever ask me a question. I will answer you. If I know the answer, I will 110% reach out and definitely answer you. So another way of not getting accurate cuts for your blocks is not lining up your fabric if you're cutting 2 sets of fabric. And I know that sounds really silly, but these are the little steps that we forget. I remember when I used to cut, I wouldn't ensure that the bottom fabric was sitting nicely on top with the other. I would just see the one on top and think, oh, becoming is good. And then when I cut, I'd be like, oh, why is this not right? So again, another silly mistake, but we take it for granted that the fabric underneath is nice and level. So just take your time. Even if you want to put this on a pressing mat and smoothen it out again, by all means, go right ahead and do that. Whatever it takes to ensure that your cuts are accurate. The only thing we haven't talked about is the bias cut. And I wanted to just make sure and get these squares first before I show you where the bias cut is. Alright, so now that I have my squares and they're all nicely even now, I know that my blocks are going to be nice and straight. Now the last thing I want to talk about is the bias. So the bias, so remember our fabrics are woven together like that as I showed you. Okay, and when we cut opposite the selvage, that's when our grain is lovely and strong, hence you don't get the stretch. All right, so there's something called the bias, and the bias is literally the middle of the fabric. So for example, I'm just thinking if I can use this, might be able to show it. So again, look at it, I haven't got my selvage on, so I'm thinking, well, where is my selvage, you know? Just check it. Look, just pressing the plot, I can see the fabric tells you. I can see it rippling at the bottom there already. I can see it spreading. I do this one, I see, oh, it's nice and straight. That's it there. Just keep double checking, all right? So the bias runs along the middle there. That's your weak. area of your fabric. So if you start just cutting your, if you just start cutting your squares and you're just like, okay, I'm gonna put, just gonna do that there, and I'm gonna do that there, you don't know where you're cutting. You're just putting it out and cutting, and very likely you are going to be cutting on the wrong grain, as I am here already, because this is the wrong grain of the fabric. So if I start cutting my squares from this way, very likely my blocks are going to be stretchy, and you will get a reminder when you start sewing, especially if you go to do further subcuts and you subcut your squares. You would realize, how come this is one side is the correct and the other side is longest? Because one side you cut correctly and the other side you cut on the bias. So the bias is the middle there. Do you see how bendy it is? That is the weakest part of the fabric. Hence the reason why it's so important that you find your selvage and you cut opposite the selvage. So that is your bias. So you can actually see where the fabric folds over. Look at that. I am not making it fold over. It folds over on its own and it's very stretchy. Okay, now I would say the bias is not the enemy. It can be your friend when you need it to, because I know I have certainly used it to my advantage. If I know I have made a little bit of a mistake and I can, or the bottom fabric is a little bit bigger or smaller, I can use my bias to give myself a nice little stretch to ensure that it meets. This is one of the reasons why quilters will say to you, after you've made your quilt top, take your fabric that you're going to use for your border and measure almost the center of your quilt top. Why is that? Because the end of your quilt top is going to be stretchy. And so when you use your fabric that you're going to use for your borders and you measure it, you're going to get the most accurate measurement in the middle there. And even though it may come up slightly shorter on the end, what that does is ensure that when you sew your borders on, is going to strengthen the edge of your quilt top. So hence the reason sometimes if you've ever noticed you've made a quilt and it doesn't sit flat on the table, you have it kind of waverly like that, it raises. That's because when you sewed your quilt top, your edges were biased, but not only that, you then use that technique of taking your strip of fabric that you're actually going to cut for your border, measure the middle of it and put it right at the end. And as I said, that really gives the quilt a lovely square up so that it's not wavy, as I like to call it, when you're sewing on your borders. So guys, I really hope that this has been helpful to you. Any questions, please just jot them down and make sure that you're doing all the steps. By all means, sometimes it takes a little bit of a while to get this going in your head, but I'm sure you will get it. I don't know what else to say to you. Any questions, do let me know. I really haven't got an issue trying to help you to make sure you understand. This is this a community we have here, so reach out to me. Let me know, as I said, what video you would like me to do next. I would be so happy to help. It gives me ideas on how I can better support you. Bye for now. Happy quilting, and I will see you in the next one. In the next one. In the next one. Bye guys. Love you so much. Have a good one. A blessed day. And again, if this video has brought you any value, let me know. Let me know. I'm so happy, aren't I? Bye.